The metallic taste of humiliation still lingered on my tongue as I sat on the cold aluminum bench, watching girls who couldn't hit a free throw to save their lives run drills I could execute blindfolded. The familiar scent of rubber and sweat filled the Lincoln High gymnasium, mixing with the sharp chemical smell of floor wax that always made my eyes water slightly. Every squeak of sneakers against polished hardwood felt like nails on a chalkboard, a constant reminder of where I should have been versus where Coach Davidson had decided I belonged. Maya, you're sitting this season out. The words echoed in my memory like a broken record, each repetition driving the knife of rejection deeper into my chest. 5'6" isn't going to cut it at the state level. We need height if we want to win championships. I traced the worn leather of my basketball shoes with trembling fingers, feeling the smooth spots where countless hours of practice had left their mark. The shoes were barely 3 months old, purchased with my own money from my summer job at the local rec center. But they already felt like artifacts from a previous life, a life where I'd believed hard work and dedication could overcome anything. The gymnasium stretched before me like a cathedral of broken dreams, its polished floors reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights that cast everything in an unforgiving glare. Championship banners hung from the rafters like prayer flags, each one representing a season when someone else's daughter had been deemed worthy of wearing the Lincoln Lions uniform in meaningful games. In my first life, God, how insane did that sound even in my own head? I'd accepted this verdict with the resigned grace of someone who'd been taught that authority figures knew best. I'd spent my senior year as a glorified equipment manager, folding uniforms and keeping statistics, while my dreams withered like flowers left too long without water. I'd gone to college on an academic scholarship, majored in sports medicine, and spent the next 17 years wondering what might have been if I'd just been born 6 inches taller. I died at 35 in a car accident on a rainy Tuesday. My biggest regret being that I'd never proven to myself, let alone anyone else, that Maya Rodriguez could ball with the best of them. But somehow, impossibly, I'd woken up on the morning of my 18th birthday again. Same creaky bed with its faded basketball-themed comforter, same sounds of my mother brewing her morning coffee in the kitchen below, the ancient percolator gurgling and hissing like a tired dragon. Same body that everyone insisted was fundamentally inadequate for the sport I'd loved since I could hold a ball. Except this time, I knew exactly what I was capable of. This time, I had 20 years of accumulated knowledge about training, nutrition, psychology, and the simple truth that talent comes in all sizes. This time, I wasn't going to let anyone else define my limitations. The sound of Coach Davidson's whistle pierced through my brooding, sharp and commanding as always. "All right, ladies, water break. Rodriguez, come help me with the equipment." Even his voice grated against my nerves now. That particular tone of barely concealed condescension that suggested I should be grateful for any opportunity to contribute to the team's success, no matter how menial. I stood slowly, my knees protesting from sitting still too long on the unforgiving bench, and walked toward the equipment cart with as much dignity as I could muster. "Maya, I know this is hard," Coach Davidson said as I began gathering loose basketballs, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a sympathetic whisper. "But college scouts want to see certain physical attributes. I'm trying to protect you from disappointment." The basketball in my hands felt heavier than it should have, weighted with all the assumptions and prejudices that had shaped my first lifetime. I bounced it once against the floor, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet gymnasium like a gunshot. "Coach," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest like a slow burning fire. "What if you're wrong?" He laughed, actually laughed, a sound that contained no humor whatsoever. "Maya, I've been coaching for 15 years. I've seen every type of player come through this program. Heart and hustle can only take you so far." I wanted to tell him about the 20 years of experience I'd somehow gained, about watching players like Isaiah Thomas tear apart defenses full of giants, about the scientific advances in training that could turn anyone into an elite athlete if they were willing to pay the price. Instead, I just nodded and continued collecting basketballs, each one a promise to myself that I'd prove every single one of his assumptions wrong. After practice, I sat in my car in the school parking lot for almost an hour, just absorbing the magnitude of what I was facing. The sun was setting behind the mountains that ringed our small Colorado town, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that should have been beautiful but just felt like a mockery of my mood. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend, Sarah Chen. Coffee? You look like you need to vent. Sarah had been my anchor in both lifetimes, the kind of friend who could read my moods from across a crowded room and always knew exactly what to say. In my first life, she'd been the one to hold me while I cried about losing my spot on the team. This time, I was determined not to need that kind of comfort. I found her at our usual spot in Grindhouse Coffee, a little local place that always smelled like cinnamon and possibility. She was already nursing a vanilla latte and had ordered my usual, black coffee with 1 sugar, which sat steaming across from her favorite corner booth. You look like someone killed your puppy, she said without preamble, her dark eyes studying my face with the intensity of someone who'd known me since we were 8 years old. Coach Davidson happened, I said, sliding into the worn vinyl seat and wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic mug. The bitter taste of the coffee matched my mood perfectly. Still being a prehistoric ass about your height? I nodded, taking another sip and savoring the slight burn against my tongue. He actually told me today that he's protecting me from disappointment, like I'm some delicate flower who can't handle reality. Sarah's expression darkened. She'd been on the receiving end of Coach Davidson's particular brand of motivational speaking herself, when she'd tried out for the tennis team's sophomore year and been told she lacked the killer instinct necessary for competitive sports. She'd gone on to become one of the top-ranked junior players in the state, but she'd never forgotten the sting of that initial rejection. So what are you going to do about it? The question hung in the air between us like incense, heavy with possibility and challenge. In my first life, I'd spent this conversation crying into my coffee and accepting that some dreams were just too big for girls like me. This time, I felt something entirely different burning in my chest, a cold, calculated determination that felt as sharp as a winter air. I'm going to prove him wrong, I said simply. How? I leaned back in the booth, my mind already racing through the tactical possibilities. I'm going to make myself impossible to ignore. I'm going to get so good that keeping me on the bench becomes more embarrassing than playing me. Sarah raised an eyebrow, a gesture I remembered from dozens of conversations across 2 lifetimes. That's a pretty tall order, no pun intended. I know, I said, and for the first time all day, I smiled. But I've got some advantages he doesn't know about. That night, I spread out my notebooks across my desk like a general planning a military campaign. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light that felt like a spotlight on my determination as I began mapping out what I privately called Operation Vindication. In my first life, I'd been in good shape, but not elite condition. I'd relied on natural talent and assumed that was enough. This time, I understood that talent was just the entry fee. Everything else had to be earned through systematic, scientific training. I started with research, diving deep into training methodologies that hadn't even existed during my first go-around as a teenager. Plyometrics for explosive power, Olympic lifting protocols for functional strength, agility programs designed by professional trainers who worked with NBA players. My parents were skeptical when I asked them to invest in a gym membership and personal training sessions. Mija, you're already in great shape, my mother said over dinner, her voice carrying that particular tone of maternal concern that suggested I might be developing an unhealthy obsession. You don't need to kill yourself in some fancy gym. I'm not trying to get in shape, Mama, I said, spearing a piece of chicken with perhaps more force than necessary. I'm trying to get in the best shape of my life. My father, who'd played college basketball himself before a knee injury ended his dreams, studied me with the intensity of someone who recognized the look in my eyes. This is about Coach Davidson, isn't it? I met his gaze steadily. This is about proving that being underestimated is a choice, not a fact. He was quiet for a long moment, the sound of our forks against ceramic plates filling the silence. Then he nodded slowly, the gesture carrying the weight of his own unfulfilled athletic dreams. Okay, he said, but if we're doing this, we're doing it right. 3 days later, I was standing in Peak Performance Training Center, a warehouse-sized facility that smelled like chalk dust and determination. My trainer was Marcus Webb, a former Division I player who'd rehabbed his way back from a career-ending injury to become one of the most sought-after performance coaches in the region. So you want to add 6 inches to your vertical leap in 4 months, he said. his voice carrying the skepticism of someone who'd heard impossible goals before. What makes you think that's achievable? I looked around the facility, taking in the medicine balls and resistance bands and elaborate jumping platforms that looked like instruments of torture. Because I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Marcus studied me for a moment, then shrugged. All right then, let's see what you're working with. The initial assessment was humbling. My vertical leap was already impressive for a high school player, 28 inches, but I needed it to be extraordinary. My lateral quickness was good, but not elite. My core strength was adequate, but not dominant. You've got decent fundamentals, Marcus said, consulting his clipboard as I gasped for air after a series of agility drills that had left my lungs burning. But if you want to compete with players 6 inches taller than you, decent isn't going to cut it. What do I need? Everything, he said bluntly. Speed that makes you uncatchable. Jumping ability that lets you see over trees. Court vision that makes you impossible to predict. And mental toughness that makes you immune to intimidation. I wiped sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand, tasting salt and possibility. When do we start? We just did. While my body was undergoing its transformation, I attacked my basketball skills with the systematic intensity of someone who'd spent 20 years thinking about what they would do differently given a second chance. Every morning at 5 a.m., I was in my driveway working on ball handling drills. The neighbors probably thought I'd lost my mind, but I didn't care. The rhythmic bounce, bounce, bounce of the basketball against cold concrete became my meditation, each repetition building muscle memory that would serve me when the pressure was highest. I studied video like it was scripture, breaking down footage of the greatest small players in basketball history frame by frame. Muggsy Bogues navigating through forests of giants. Allen Iverson creating separation with nothing but willpower and hip movement. Chris Paul orchestrating offenses like a conductor directing a symphony. But it wasn't enough to just copy what they did. I needed to understand why it worked and how to adapt it to my own game. I started keeping detailed notes in a composition notebook that I carried everywhere, documenting weaknesses I observed in opposing players, strategies that worked against different defensive schemes, and psychological tactics that could give me advantages that had nothing to do with physical measurements. You're becoming obsessed, Sarah observed one afternoon as we sat in the school library, my notebook spread open between us like a battle plan. No, I corrected, not looking up from my analysis of how to exploit over-aggressive hedge defenses. I'm becoming prepared. The truth was, I was obsessed, but it was the kind of obsession that felt like destiny rather than compulsion. Every drill I ran, every video I studied, every note I took was building towards something larger than just making the basketball team. I was constructing a version of myself that would be undeniable. Here's what I'd learned in my first life that most people never figure out. Basketball is played as much between the ears as between the lines. The best players aren't necessarily the most talented. They're the ones who can manipulate the mental game to their advantage. I started with my teammates not because I wanted to undermine them, but because I needed them to see me differently. Instead of being the girl who got cut from the team, I needed to become the girl who knew more about basketball than anyone else in the building. I began showing up to their pickup games at the outdoor courts near downtown, not to dominate, but to demonstrate value. When Jessica Wong, our star player, was struggling with her left-hand dribble, I spent 20 minutes teaching her a drill I'd learned from watching Kyrie Irving highlights. When Emma Martinez couldn't figure out how to defend pick and rolls, I walked her through the footwork step by step. How do you know all this stuff? Jessica asked after I'd helped her fix a shooting flaw that had been plaguing her for weeks. I watch a lot of film, I said, which was true but not the whole truth. And I think about the game differently than most people. Word started spreading through the team's informal network that Maya Rodriguez actually knew what she was talking about. More importantly, they started seeing me as someone who could help them get better, rather than someone who was competing with them for playing time. The psychological campaign extended to Coach Davidson himself, though this required more subtlety. I started volunteering to help with equipment and statistics, positioning myself as indispensable in ways that had nothing to do with my height. When he was breaking down film with the team, I would occasionally offer insights that demonstrated my basketball IQ without challenging his authority directly. Rodriguez makes a good point about their weak side rotation. he admitted grudgingly after I'd identified a defensive tendency that our opponents had been exploiting. Each small acknowledgement was a step toward my larger goal, making him see me as a basketball mind rather than just a body that didn't fit his template. Revenge, I'd learned, was rarely a solo endeavor. Even Michael Jordan needed Scottie Pippen. Even Kobe Bryant needed Shaq. I needed allies who would advocate for me when the crucial moments came. I found my first recruit in an unexpected place, Derek Morrison, the boys' team captain who'd always been polite but dismissive. In my first life, I'd harbored a hopeless crush on him that had clouded my judgment. This time, I saw him for what he really was, a decent player with excellent connections and the kind of social capital that could open doors. "I need a favor," I told him after cornering him by his locker one afternoon. He looked surprised. Maya Rodriguez had never been the type to ask for favors, particularly not from boys she barely knew. "What kind of favor?" "I need you to help me get into the elite summer camp at Colorado State." The camp was invitation only, designed for players who were already being recruited by Division I schools. Getting in as a high school senior who wasn't even on her school team would be nearly impossible through normal channels. "Why would you want to go to that camp?" Derek asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "It's for players who are already committed to college programs." "Because I'm going to be one of those players," I said simply. He stared at me for a moment, probably trying to determine if I was delusional or just extremely confident. "Maya, you're not even on the team." "Yet," I corrected, "I'm not on the team yet." Something in my tone must have convinced him that I was serious because he nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" "Your dad knows the camp director, right? From when he played at CSU?" Derek's father had been a walk-on player in college who'd parlayed that experience into a successful business career and extensive connections in Colorado basketball circles. One phone call from him would carry more weight than 100 applications from unknown players. "He might," Derek said carefully, "but he's not going to stick his neck out for someone who might embarrass him." "Then I guess I'll have to make sure that doesn't happen." 3 months into my transformation, something extraordinary happened during one of our informal pickup games. We were playing 4-on-4 on the outdoor courts, shirts versus skins, when a group of boys from the neighboring town showed up looking for competition. They were good, really good. The kind of players who dominated their high school teams and were heading to Division II programs in the fall. They took one look at our group, which included 3 girls, and started making comments about how this was going to be target practice. "Hope you ladies are ready to get schooled," their point guard announced, his voice carrying the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been challenged by female competition. I felt something cold and familiar settle in my chest, the same feeling I'd carried through my first life every time someone dismissed me before I'd even had a chance to compete. This time, though, it felt different. This time, it felt like fuel. "Let's play," I said simply. The first few possessions went as expected. They scored easily against our bigger players, using their strength and speed to dominate the paint. We managed to keep pace by hitting outside shots, but it was clear we were fighting an uphill battle. That's when I decided to stop playing nice. The first time I got the ball in transition, I caught their point guard napping on defense. He was already celebrating their next basket in his head when I blew past him like he was standing still. The layup was routine, but the speed and decisiveness weren't. "Lucky break," he muttered as we headed back up court. The second time he was ready for my drive, but not for my pull-up jumper from just inside the three-point line. The shot was pure, hitting nothing but net, and for the first time, I saw doubt creep into his expression. By the time I'd scored 12 straight points and our team had taken the lead, the entire dynamic of the game had shifted. The boys who'd come to dominate were now fighting just to stay competitive, and everyone watching could feel the tension ratcheting higher with each possession. The moment that changed everything came with the score tied and next basket wins. Their biggest player, a 6'4" forward who'd been talking trash all game, decided to guard me personally, probably figuring his size advantage would end the contest quickly. "Come on, little girl," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's see what you've got." I'd been in this exact situation hundreds of times in my dreams and nightmares, facing down someone who assumed their physical advantages made victory inevitable. The difference was that this time, I'd spent 3 months preparing for exactly this moment. I took the ball at the top of the key, sizing him up like a predator evaluating prey. He was crouched low, arms spread wide, confident that his wingspan would prevent me from getting a clean shot. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't planning to shoot over him. I drove hard to my right, using a crossover dribble that had become second nature through hours of practice. When he committed to cutting off that angle, I planted my left foot and exploded back toward the basket, my months of plyometric training translating into a first step that caught him completely off guard. He recovered quickly enough to challenge the shot, leaving his feet and extending his arms to block what he assumed would be a layup. Instead, I gathered the ball and rose to meet him, channeling every rep I'd done in the weight room and every visualization session I'd completed. The dunk wasn't just clean, it was emphatic. My hand finished well above the rim as the ball slammed through the net and the sound of the impact seemed to echo across the entire court. When I landed and looked up at the 6'4" forward, who was still processing what had just happened, I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before directed at me. Respect. The small crowd that had gathered to watch erupted in disbelief. Someone was recording with their phone, and within hours, the video would be circulating through the local basketball community with captions like, "Did this girl just dunk on a college player?" But the reaction that mattered most came from Jessica Wong, who'd been watching from the sideline. "Maya," she said as we walked back toward our cars, her voice carrying a note of awe that made my chest swell with pride. "Where the hell did that come from?" "It was always there," I said, and for the first time, I actually believed it. I just needed to figure out how to let it out. News of my dunk spread through Lincoln High like wildfire, carried by the same social media networks that had once ignored my existence. By Monday morning, I couldn't walk down a hallway without someone stopping to ask if the video was real or to request a demonstration of my newfound vertical leap. The attention was intoxicating, but also dangerous. I'd learned in my first life that being underestimated was painful, but being overhyped came with its own set of pressures. The key was staying focused on my ultimate goal while managing the expectations that were building around me. Coach Davidson called me into his office during lunch on Tuesday, and I knew the moment of truth had arrived. His office was exactly as I remembered it, cramped and cluttered, with motivational posters covering every available wall space and the faint smell of old coffee permeating everything. "I've been hearing some interesting stories about you," he said without preamble, gesturing for me to take a seat in the uncomfortable plastic chair across from his desk. "People like to talk," I said carefully, not wanting to seem either dismissive or overly eager. He pulled out his phone and queued up the video that had been making rounds all week. The footage wasn't perfect, shot from a distance by someone with shaky hands, but it clearly showed me rising above a much taller defender to complete a powerful dunk. "This is you?" "Yes, sir." He watched the video again, his expression unreadable. I could hear the sounds of students in the hallway outside, their voices and laughter feeling distant and surreal as I waited for his verdict. "You know," he said finally, "when I made the decision to cut you from the team, it was based on what I thought was realistic assessment of your potential at the varsity level." I remained silent, understanding that this was one of those moments where saying the wrong thing could derail everything I'd been working toward. But I'm starting to think I might have been premature in that assessment. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a campfire, visible but insubstantial, carrying possibility but no guarantees. "Our point guard situation has been inconsistent this season," he continued, consulting a folder that I assumed contained our team's statistics. "Emma's got great court vision, but she's not a scoring threat from the outside. Jessica's a natural scorer, but she sometimes forces shots when she should be facilitating." I nodded, having observed these exact weaknesses during my months of studying the team from the bench. "What I need," Coach Davidson said, his voice gaining confidence as he talked through the problem, "is someone who can do both. Someone who can run the offense but also create their own shot when necessary." "Coach," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I can do both." He looked at me for a long moment, probably weighing the risks of admitting he'd made a mistake against the potential benefits of adding a player who might actually help the team win games. "Prove it," he said finally. "Friday's game against Riverside is a non-conference matchup. Low stakes, good opportunity to see what you can do against varsity competition. You'll get meaningful minutes off the bench. I felt something that might have been relief flooding through my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. This wasn't victory yet, it was just opportunity. Everything I'd worked for over the past 3 months would be meaningless if I couldn't perform when it mattered. I won't let you down, I said. You better not, he replied, his tone suggesting that second chances were a limited commodity in his world. Because if you embarrass me, or this team, you'll never see the court again. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. I ran through my mental checklist obsessively. Shot mechanics, defensive responsibilities, offensive sets, contingency plans for every possible scenario I might face. The Riverside game was being held at their gym, a compact, hostile environment where the crowd sat close enough to the court that you could hear individual comments from the stands. It was exactly the kind of atmosphere that could either elevate a player's performance or destroy their confidence completely. I arrived at the visiting locker room 2 hours before game time, my stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and terror that felt like swallowing lightning. The familiar ritual of putting on my uniform, the same uniform I'd been denied for most of the season, felt like donning armor for battle. You ready for this? Jessica asked as she laced up her sneakers beside me. I've been ready, I said, and realized I actually meant it. The JV game was wrapping up when we took the court for warm-ups, and I could feel eyes tracking my movements as I went through my pre-game routine. Some of the attention was curious. People who'd heard about the girl who'd dunked on a college player and wanted to see if the hype was real. Some of it was skeptical, coaches and players who figured I was just another overhyped story that would crumble under pressure. All of it was fuel. Riverside came out in a zone defense designed to pack the paint and force us to beat them from the outside. It was a smart strategy against our usual lineup, which relied heavily on interior scoring, but they'd clearly not accounted for the possibility that our new point guard might change their defensive calculations. I entered the game with 4 minutes left in the first quarter and our team trailing by 8 points. The Riverside crowd greeted my arrival with polite applause, the kind of acknowledgement you give to a JV player who's getting her first taste of varsity action. The first time I touched the ball, their point guard sagged off me by several feet, daring me to shoot from distance. It was exactly the kind of disrespect I'd been preparing for, and I responded by pulling up from well beyond the three-point line and draining the shot cleanly. The sound of the ball snapping through the net was followed by a moment of surprised silence, then scattered applause from our small contingent of traveling fans. Lucky shot, I heard someone from Riverside's bench mutter, loud enough to be picked up by the referee's microphones. They stopped calling it lucky after I hit my next 3 attempts from beyond the arc. By halftime, I had 14 points, 5 assists, and 3 steals, and the entire complexion of the game had changed. Our team, which had looked sluggish and disjointed in the early going, was suddenly playing with the kind of confidence that comes from having a player who can create scoring opportunities out of nothing. More importantly, I was playing with the kind of freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything to prove. How are you feeling? Coach Davidson asked during our halftime break, his voice carrying a note of genuine interest rather than his usual skeptical assessment. Like I'm just getting warmed up, I said, and I could see something shift in his expression. A recognition that maybe, just maybe, he'd discovered something special. The second half was a masterclass in controlled aggression. Every possession became an opportunity to demonstrate a different aspect of my game. When they played me tight, I drove past them with the explosive first step I'd developed through months of training. When they sagged off, I hit shots from distances that stretched their defense beyond its comfort zone. When they doubled me, I found open teammates with passes that drew gasps from both benches. But the moment that announced my arrival, really announced it, came with 3 minutes left in the fourth quarter. We were up by 12, the game essentially decided, when Riverside's coach called a timeout to rest his starters and give his bench players some experience. It was the kind of garbage time that usually featured sloppy play and reduced intensity, but I saw it as one final opportunity to make a statement. Their backup center, a 6'1" junior who'd been talking trash from the bench all game, decided to challenge me when I drove toward the basket on what should have been a routine layup. He left his feet early, trying to intimidate me with his size, and gave me exactly the opening I'd been visualizing for months. I gathered the ball and rose to meet him, my months of plyometric training translating into hang time that seemed to suspend the laws of physics. As I soared above his outstretched arms, time slowed to a crawl, and I could hear the collective intake of breath from everyone in the gymnasium. The dunk was clean and authoritative, my hand finishing well above the rim as the ball powered through the net. The sound of the impact echoed through the suddenly silent arena, followed by an eruption of noise that seemed to shake the building's foundation. I hung on the rim for just a moment, long enough to look down at the 6'1" player who was still processing what had just happened, then dropped to the floor and sprinted back on defense as if dunking over taller players was just another item on my checklist. The Riverside crowd was on its feet, their loyalty temporarily forgotten in the face of something they'd never seen before. Even their players were staring at me with expressions that ranged from disbelief to grudging respect. But the reaction that meant the most came from my own teammates, who surrounded me during the next time out with the kind of excitement usually reserved for championship victories. "Maya, that was insane!" Emma screamed, her voice barely audible over the continuing crowd noise. "Where did that come from?" Jessica demanded, grabbing my shoulders and shaking me like she was trying to wake me from a dream. "It was always there," I said, repeating the words that were becoming my personal mantra. I just needed the right opportunity to show it. When the final buzzer sounded on our 18-point victory, I had 26 points, 9 assists, and 4 steals, plus one dunk that would be shared thousands of times on social media before I even made it back to the locker room. But more than the statistics, I had something that couldn't be measured on any score sheet: the absolute certainty that I belonged on this court, in this uniform, playing this game at the highest level I could reach. The video of my dunk went viral overnight, spreading through basketball communities across the state, and eventually catching the attention of local news stations. By Monday morning, I was fielding interview requests from reporters who wanted to know about the 5'6" sensation, who was redefining what people thought was possible on a basketball court. The attention was surreal, but also validating in ways I hadn't expected. For months, I'd been working toward this moment in relative obscurity, driven by internal motivation and the memories of my first life's disappointments. Suddenly, complete strangers were celebrating my success and sharing their own stories of being underestimated and overlooked. Maya Rodriguez shows us that heart beats height every time, read one particularly gratifying headline in the Denver Post's sports section. But the reaction that mattered most came from Coach Davidson, who called me into his office first thing Monday morning with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been approaching respect. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble, the words seeming to scrape against his throat as he forced them out. "When I made the decision to cut you from the team, I was basing it on outdated assumptions about what makes a basketball player successful." I remained silent, understanding that this was his moment to reckon with his own limitations, not mine to make easier for him. "You've proven that I was wrong," he continued, consulting a folder that contained printouts of the articles that had been written about my performance. "Not just about your abilities, but about my responsibility as a coach to recognize potential rather than just current performance." "Coach," I said carefully, "I appreciate that, but I'm not interested in apologies. I'm interested in opportunities." He looked up from the folder, something like surprise flickering across his features. "What kind of opportunities?" "I want to start," I said simply. "I want to be the point guard for this team, and I want to help us win a state championship." The boldness of the statement hung in the air between us like a challenge. 6 months ago, I'd been begging just for a spot on the roster. Now I was demanding a starting position and declaring championship aspirations. "That's a big ask," Coach Davidson said slowly. "I'm a big talent," I replied, and for the first time in either of my lifetimes, I truly believed it. He studied me for a long moment, probably trying to reconcile the confident young woman sitting across from him with the dejected girl he'd cut from the team just months earlier. "Okay," he said finally. "You'll start at point guard against Morrison Prep on Friday. It's a conference game, so the stakes are higher. If you can perform at that level consistently, we'll talk about the rest of the season." I stood up, my hand already reaching for the door handle. "Coach, you're not going to regret this decision." "I better not," he said, but his voice carried conviction rather than threat this time. Because if you can really do what you showed me Friday night, we might actually have something special here. Phase 9, Proving Ground. The Morrison prep game represented everything I'd been building toward, a chance to prove that my breakout performance hadn't been a fluke, that I could consistently perform at the level required to compete with the best teams in our conference. Morrison was loaded with Division I recruits and had been ranked in the top 10 statewide all season. Their point guard, Rachel Kim, was headed to Stanford and had been featured in Sports Illustrated's high school preview. Their forwards were both over 6 feet tall and had already committed to Pac-12 programs. In other words, they were exactly the kind of team that was supposed to expose players like me as pretenders rather than contenders. The game was being held at our home gym, which meant friendly crowds and familiar sightlines. But it also meant heightened expectations from fans who'd seen the viral videos and were expecting fireworks every time I touched the ball. I arrived at the gymnasium 3 hours before tip-off, needing the solitude to center myself and run through my mental preparation routines. The empty arena felt like a cathedral, all echoing spaces and reverent silence, with late afternoon sunlight streaming through the high windows and casting long shadows across the polished hardwood. I went through my shooting routine methodically, starting close to the basket and working my way out to the three-point line. Each shot was a meditation, a conversation between muscle memory and mental focus that had become as natural as breathing. The rhythm of catch and release, the satisfying snap of the net, the soft bounce of the ball returning to my hands, all of it combined to create a state of calm readiness that I'd learned to cultivate during my months of preparation. By the time my teammates arrived for warm-ups, I was completely locked in, my mind clear and my body loose. The nervous energy that had plagued me during my first varsity appearance had been replaced by something much more dangerous, quiet confidence. "You look different," Jessica observed as we went through our pre-game stretching routine. "Different how?" "Like you belong here," she said. And I realized she was right. Somewhere during my transformation from bench warmer to starter, I'd stopped feeling like an imposter who might be exposed at any moment and started feeling like a player who deserved to be on this court. The Morrison prep players filed into our gym with the casual arrogance of a team that had rarely been challenged all season. They were bigger, more athletic, and clearly more experienced at the varsity level. Their warm-up routine was crisp and professional, executed with the kind of precision that comes from playing together for multiple seasons. But as I watched them go through their drills, I noticed something that gave me hope. They were going through the motions, treating this like just another game against just another overmatched opponent. They hadn't done their homework on our recent changes, and they certainly hadn't prepared for the possibility that a 5'6" point guard might present challenges their scouting report hadn't anticipated. Rachel Kim was everything her reputation suggested: fluid, athletic, with the kind of court vision that made difficult passes look routine. During warm-ups, she moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd never met a defender she couldn't break down or a shot she couldn't create. But I'd spent weeks studying video of her performances, identifying patterns in her decision-making and tendencies in her defensive positioning. I knew she preferred to force turnovers through aggressive pressure rather than disciplined technique. I knew she sometimes got careless with her dribble when she thought she had a speed advantage. Most importantly, I knew she'd never faced anyone quite like me. The opening tip went to Morrison, and Rachel immediately tried to establish dominance by attacking our defense aggressively. She blew past Emma with a lightning-quick first step, elevated for what should have been an easy layup, and found herself staring at empty air as I rotated over to strip the ball cleanly from her hands. The steal led to a fast break opportunity, and I pushed the pace immediately, knowing that transition basketball was where smaller players could neutralize size advantages. I found Jessica streaking down the right side and delivered a perfect bounce pass that she converted into an easy score. "Nice help," Jessica said, as we jogged back on defense, but I was already focused on the next possession. Rachel came back with a pull-up jumper that rattled in despite solid defense. Her shot just a fraction too quick for our rotation to contest effectively. She pointed down court as she backpedaled, the universal signal that she was planning to make this a long night for whoever was trying to guard her. What she didn't realize was that I'd been planning for this exact scenario for months. The next time down court, I called for a screen from Emma and used it to create just enough separation for a three-point attempt. The shot felt perfect leaving my hands, Smooth release, ideal arc, confidence born from thousands of practice repetitions, and it dropped through the net without touching the rim. The crowd's reaction was immediate and loud, but what caught my attention was Rachel's expression as she inbounded the ball. For just a moment, her casual confidence wavered, replaced by something that might have been concern. Good. Concerned opponents made mistakes. The first quarter became a chess match between two players who understood that basketball was as much about psychology as athleticism. Rachel would make a spectacular play, and I would answer with something equally impressive. She would try to press me defensively, and I would use her aggression against her by finding backdoor cuts for my teammates. By the end of the first quarter, we were tied at 18, and I could hear murmurs from the crowd about how this wasn't supposed to be competitive. Morrison Prep was ranked 7th in the state for a reason, and they weren't supposed to struggle against a team that had been mediocre before my arrival. During the break between quarters, Coach Davidson pulled me aside. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine interest rather than his usual skeptical assessment. "Like I'm just getting started," I said, and I could see him fighting back a smile. The second quarter was when I decided to take over. Morrison had made defensive adjustments, switching to a pressure defense designed to speed up our offense and force turnovers. It was exactly the kind of adjustment that had worked against our team earlier in the season, when our ball handling had been inconsistent and our decision-making questionable. But they were pressuring a different player now. I broke their press with a combination of court vision and pure speed that left their defenders scrambling to recover. Instead of the careful, methodical offense we'd been running, I pushed the pace relentlessly, turning every rebound into a potential fast break opportunity. The dunk came midway through the quarter, on a play that started with a defensive rebound and a quick outlet pass. I caught the ball in transition with numbers in our favor, 3 attackers against 2 defenders, and made the decision to finish the play myself rather than look for the easy assist. Rachel was one of the 2 defenders back, and I could see her making the calculation that her speed would allow her to cut off my drive to the basket. What she couldn't account for was the explosive vertical leap I'd developed through months of plyometric training. I gathered the ball at the free throw line and took off, rising above her reaching arms and the surprised face of Morrison's help defender. The dunk was emphatic and clean, my hand finishing well above the rim as the ball slammed through the net with authority. The reaction from our home crowd was deafening, a wall of sound that seemed to shake the entire building. But what I noticed most was the silence from Morrison's bench, the kind of stunned quiet that comes from watching something you didn't think was possible. I landed softly and sprinted back on defense, not bothering to celebrate or showboat. This wasn't about entertainment. It was about sending a message that the assumptions about what I could and couldn't do were woefully outdated. By halftime, I had 19 points, 7 assists, and 4 steals, and we led by 9 points. More importantly, I could see doubt creeping into Morrison's body language. They were supposed to be the superior team, but they were trailing a squad led by a player they'd never heard of 6 months ago. "Whatever you're doing out there," Coach Davidson said during our halftime break, "keep doing it." The third quarter was when Morrison made their desperate adjustments. They switched to a box-and-one defense specifically designed to contain me, with Rachel shadowing my every movement while their other 4 players played zone behind her. It was a compliment in its way, acknowledgement that I'd become dangerous enough to warrant special attention. But it was also an opportunity to demonstrate the one skill that couldn't be taught or trained, the ability to make everyone around me better. With Rachel draped all over me, I became a distributor rather than a scorer. I found Emma for open looks in the paint. I created opportunities for Jessica to attack mismatches. I turned Sarah into a legitimate 3-point threat by finding her in spots where the zone couldn't recover quickly enough. "This is beautiful basketball," I heard someone from the crowd say during a timeout, and I realized they were right. We were playing with the kind of chemistry and intelligence that usually took years to develop. Morrison abandoned the box-and-one midway through the fourth quarter, switching back to man-to-man defense as they desperately tried to cut into our lead. But by then, it was too late. My teammates had tasted success and gained confidence, and they weren't about to let this opportunity slip away. The final score was 76-62, a margin of victory that didn't fully capture how thoroughly we dominated the game's second half. I finished with 28 points, 12 assists, and 6 steals. But the statistics that mattered most were the ones that didn't show up in the box score: the confidence we'd gained, the statement we'd made, and the message we'd sent to every team in our conference. After the game, as I was walking toward the locker room, Rachel Kim caught up with me near the tunnel. "Good game," she said, extending her hand with the kind of respect that had to be earned rather than given. "You too," I replied, meaning it. She was everything her reputation suggested: skilled, competitive, and classy in defeat. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice dropping to a level that wouldn't be overheard by the reporters who were still conducting interviews nearby. "Sure." 6 months ago, nobody had heard of you. Now you're playing like you've been doing this your whole life. What changed? I thought about how to answer that question, how to explain 20 years of accumulated knowledge, months of systematic preparation, and the kind of motivation that comes from being told you're not good enough once too often. "I stopped listening to people who told me what I couldn't do," I said finally, and started showing them what I would do instead. She nodded slowly, like someone who understood exactly what that meant. "Well," she said with a rueful smile, "I wish I'd never had to find out." Word of our upset victory over Morrison Prep spread through the state basketball community like wildfire. By Monday morning, our game highlights were being featured on local sports shows, and I was fielding interview requests from reporters who wanted to know about the overnight sensation, who'd seemingly appeared from nowhere. But the attention I cared about most was coming from college scouts who'd started showing up at our practices and calling Coach Davidson to inquire about my academic eligibility and recruitment timeline. "I've got 3 Division I coaches coming to Thursday's game," Coach Davidson told me during our post-practice meeting, his voice carrying a note of amazement that he was still trying to process. "Including someone from Colorado State who says they've been hearing your name all over the Front Range." I nodded calmly, though inside I was celebrating the vindication of every prediction I'd made about my own potential. The girl who'd been cut from the team for being too short was now attracting interest from programs that had never given a second thought to players from small-town Colorado. "There's something else," Coach Davidson continued, consulting a folder thick with papers and printouts. "The state tournament committee released the updated rankings this morning. We're now ranked 15th in Class 4A. The significance of that number hit me like lightning. Teams ranked in the top 16 received automatic bids to the state tournament. For the first time in school history, Lincoln High was being considered a legitimate contender for a state championship." "Coach," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system, "we're just getting started." Thursday's game against Valley Prep drew the largest crowd in our gymnasium's history. The stands were packed with college scouts, local reporters, and fans who'd driven from neighboring towns to see if the hype about Maya Rodriguez was real. Valley Prep was ranked 9th in the state and featured the kind of balanced attack that had made them conference champions for 3 consecutive years. Their point guard was a senior who'd already signed with Air Force Academy, and their forwards were both over 6 feet tall with college-level athleticism. In other words, they were exactly the kind of team that was supposed to expose us as a one-hit wonder riding the momentum of a single upset victory. The game started as a defensive battle, with both teams feeling each other out and trying to establish rhythm against unfamiliar opponents. Valley's game plan was obvious from the opening possession. They were going to try to turn the game into a physical, grinding affair that would neutralize our speed advantage. For the first 8 minutes, their strategy worked perfectly. The pace was slow, the scoring was limited, and we looked like a team that was pressing too hard to live up to unrealistic expectations. That's when I decided to change the tenor of the entire contest. I stole a lazy pass from their point guard and pushed the ball in transition, drawing 2 defenders and leaving Emma with an easy basket underneath. On the next possession, I hit a 3-pointer from NBA range that had the crowd on its feet. 2 possessions later, I found Jessica with a no-look pass that led to another score. Within 3 minutes, we'd turned a grinding defensive battle into an up-tempo showcase that played directly to our strengths. More importantly, I demonstrated the one thing that separates good players from great ones: the ability to impose your will on a game when circumstances require it. By halftime, we led by 14, and I could see Valley's coach frantically diagramming adjustments on his clipboard. But the problem with trying to adjust to someone like me was that I'd spent months preparing for every possible defensive scheme they might throw at us. They tried a full court press in the third quarter, hoping to speed up our offense and create turnovers. I broke it with court vision and ball handling skills that made their pressure look like a drill cone exercise. They tried switching to a zone defense, packing the paint, and daring us to beat them from the outside. I responded by hitting 4 three-pointers in a 6-minute span, each one from a different spot on the floor. They tried doubling me every time I touched the ball, hoping to force turnovers or difficult shots. I turned into a distributor, finding open teammates with passes that had the college scouts frantically scribbling notes. But the moment that defined the game, and my emergence as a legitimate college prospect, came with 2 minutes left in the fourth quarter. We were up by 18, the game essentially decided, when Valley's best player decided to make one last statement. He was a 6'4" forward named Marcus Thompson, who'd been talking trash all game, constantly reminding anyone within earshot that he was headed to a Division I program while I was just a flash in the pan. During a timeout, he made sure his voice was loud enough for me to hear. "Enjoy this while it lasts, shorty. This is as good as it gets for players like you." The words hit me like a match striking gasoline, not because they hurt, but because they represented everything I'd been fighting against for 2 lifetimes. The assumption that physical measurements determined potential. The belief that some people were simply destined for greatness, while others should be grateful for whatever scraps they were thrown. When play resumed, I called for the ball and isolated against him at the top of the key. The crowd sensed something special was about to happen. That electricity that fills an arena when everyone knows they're about to witness something memorable. Marcus crouched into his defensive stance, probably confident that his 6-inch height advantage and 40-pound weight advantage would allow him to control whatever I was planning to do. He was wrong. I drove hard to my right, using a crossover dribble that had become my signature move through months of practice. When he committed to cutting off that angle, I planted my left foot and exploded back toward the basket with the kind of explosive first step that can't be taught or simulated. He recovered quickly, using his length to challenge what he assumed would be a layup attempt. Instead, I gathered the ball and rose to meet him, my months of plyometric training translating into hang time that seemed to defy physics. The dunk was clean and powerful, my hand finishing well above the rim, as Marcus stared up at me with an expression of complete disbelief. The crowd erupted in a wall of sound that seemed to shake the building's foundation, but what I noticed most was the silence from Valley's bench. The kind of stunned quiet that comes from watching your assumptions get demolished in real time. I hung on the rim for just a moment longer than necessary, looking down at Marcus as he processed what had just happened. Then I dropped to the floor and pointed toward the crowd, acknowledging the fans who'd believed in me when almost nobody else would. "Holy shit!" I heard someone scream from the student section. Did Maya Rodriguez just end that dude's career? The final score was 89-67, but the margin of victory didn't capture the psychological impact of what had happened. I finished with 34 points, 15 assists, and 7 steals, but more importantly, I'd established myself as someone who could rise to meet any challenge. After the game, the interview request came from regional and national media outlets. ESPN wanted to feature me on their high school basketball show. Sports Illustrated was planning a story about small-town success stories. Recruiting websites had suddenly elevated me to 5-star prospect status. But the conversation that mattered most came from Dr. Patricia Hayes, the head coach from UConn who'd been sitting in the front row taking notes throughout the entire game. "Maya," she said as I was heading toward the locker room, "do you have a few minutes to talk?" We found a quiet corner of the hallway, away from the reporters and fans who were still celebrating our victory. Dr. Hayes was exactly as I'd imagined her, from watching UConn games on television, composed, intelligent, with the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding attention. "I've been coaching for 22 years, she said without preamble, and I've seen every type of player you can imagine. Tall ones, fast ones, strong ones, smart ones. But I've rarely seen someone who combines all those attributes with the kind of leadership you displayed tonight." I remained silent, understanding that this was one of those moments where listening was more important than talking. "We've been following your story since that first video went viral," she continued. "What impresses me isn't just your improvement. It's the systematic way you've approached that improvement. The work ethic, the preparation, the mental toughness. Those are the qualities we look for in players who can contribute to championship programs." Coach Hayes, I said carefully, are you offering me a scholarship? She smiled, the first time I'd seen her expression soften during our entire conversation. Maya, I'm offering you something better than a scholarship. I'm offering you a chance to prove that everything you've accomplished so far is just the beginning. 3 weeks later, we were boarding a bus for the state tournament, ranked 8th in the final regular season poll, and riding a 12-game winning streak that had started with my first varsity appearance. The transformation of our team's culture had been as dramatic as my individual emergence. Players who'd been tentative and uncertain had become confident and aggressive, fueled by the belief that anything was possible. The state tournament was being held in Denver, at the same arena where the Colorado Avalanche played their home games. For most of my teammates, it was the largest venue they'd ever competed in, with seating for nearly 20,000 fans and television coverage that would broadcast our games across the entire state. I'd been here before, in my first life, but only as a spectator watching other teams achieve the dreams that had been deemed too big for someone my size. This time, I was walking onto the court as a legitimate star player on a team that nobody wanted to face in the tournament bracket. Our first-round opponent was Greeley West, a program with a proud tradition and a roster full of seniors who'd been playing together since middle school. They were bigger, more experienced, and had the kind of championship pedigree that was supposed to intimidate upstart teams like ours. Instead, we came out like a team that had been waiting our entire lives for this opportunity. I scored 11 points in the first quarter, including 3 three-pointers that stretched their defense beyond its comfort zone. More importantly, I got my teammates involved early, finding Emma for easy baskets and creating opportunities for Jessica to establish her rhythm. By halftime, we led by 19, and the crowd was beginning to take notice of the small school team that was playing with the kind of confidence usually reserved for perennial powerhouses. The second half was academic. Greeley West made desperate adjustments, but they were trying to solve a puzzle that had too many moving pieces. Every time they focused on stopping me, I found open teammates. Every time they tried to control our pace, I pushed the tempo beyond their comfort zone. The final score was 94-71, a margin of victory that announced our arrival on the state tournament stage in emphatic fashion. I finished with 29 points and 13 assists, but the statistic that mattered most was that we'd advanced to the quarterfinals for the first time in school history. After the game, I found a quiet corner of the locker room and called my parents. "Mija, we're so proud of you," my mother said, her voice thick with emotion that carried clearly through the phone. "Your father is crying like a baby." "Tell him I love him," I said, my own voice catching slightly, as the magnitude of what we'd accomplished began to sink in. "Maya," my father's voice came through the speaker, "you've shown everyone that dreams don't have size requirements." Our quarterfinal opponent was Boulder Prep, the defending state champions and the top-ranked team in the tournament bracket. They featured 2 players who'd already signed with Pac-12 programs and a coaching staff that had won 4 state titles in the past decade. In other words, they were exactly the kind of team that was supposed to end our Cinderella story and restore the natural order of Colorado high school basketball. The game was scheduled for prime time on Friday night, with statewide television coverage and a crowd that included college scouts from every major program in the region. As I walked onto the court for warm-ups, I could feel the weight of expectations and the electricity of a moment that would define everything I'd worked toward. Boulder Prep came out with the kind of aggressive defense that had made them champions. Full court pressure designed to speed up our offense and create turnovers. For the first few minutes, their strategy worked perfectly. We looked tentative and uncertain, like a team that was overwhelmed by the moment and the magnitude of the opposition. That's when I realized I needed to take over the game from the opening possession. I called for the ball and attacked their press with the kind of controlled aggression that had become my signature. Instead of trying to work through their pressure, I broke it with pure speed and court vision, turning their defensive intensity into fast break opportunities for our offense. The dunk came 6 minutes into the first quarter, on a play that started with a steal and ended with me rising above 2 defenders to throw down a thunderous slam that had the crowd on its feet. But more than the athleticism, it was a statement about who was going to control the tempo and tenor of this game. By the end of the first quarter, we led by 8, and Boulder Prep's coaching staff was already making adjustments that suggested they recognized they were in a fight they hadn't expected. The rest of the game became a showcase for everything I'd learned about leadership, strategy, and the kind of mental toughness that separates good players from great ones. Every possession became an opportunity to demonstrate a different aspect of my game, scoring when we needed baskets, distributing when my teammates had better looks, defending when we needed stops. The final score was 81-76, a victory that sent us to the state semifinals and confirmed what I'd known in my heart for months, that the girl who'd been told she was too short to compete at this level was now one of the best players in Colorado. Our semifinal opponent was Jefferson Academy, a program that had reached the state championship game in each of the past 3 seasons. They were led by a 6'3" center named Amanda Walsh, who'd already committed to Stanford, and a point guard named Kayla Morrison, who was being recruited by every major program in the Pac-12. The game represented everything I'd been building toward, a chance to prove that all the assumptions about height requirements and physical limitations were not just wrong, but catastrophically outdated. Jefferson came out in a zone defense designed to pack the paint and force us to beat them from the outside. It was a smart strategy against most teams, but they'd clearly not done their homework on how dramatically our offensive capabilities had evolved since my arrival in the starting lineup. I responded by hitting 5 3-pointers in the first half, each one from a different spot on the floor, and each one delivered with the kind of confidence that comes from thousands of practice repetitions. More importantly, the attention I drew opened up opportunities for my teammates to attack mismatches and exploit gaps in their defense. By halftime, we led by 12, and I could see doubt creeping into Jefferson's body language. They were supposed to be the superior team, but they were trailing a squad led by a player who hadn't even been on the varsity roster at the beginning of the season. The third quarter was when Jefferson made their desperate push. They switched to man-to-man defense and started pressing full court, hoping to speed up our offense and create the kind of turnovers that could swing momentum in their favor. Instead, I turned their aggression against them, using their pressure to create fast break opportunities and easy baskets for teammates who were running the floor with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from believing anything is possible. The dunk that sealed our victory came with 3 minutes left in the fourth quarter. Jefferson had just cut our lead to 6 and was gaining momentum when I stole a lazy pass and found myself alone in transition with their center scrambling to get back in position. Amanda Walsh was everything her reputation suggested: big, athletic, and skilled enough to play at the Division I level. But as I gathered the ball and approached the basket, I could see in her eyes the same assumption that had plagued me throughout my basketball career, the belief that smaller players couldn't finish over bigger ones. I rose above her reaching arms with this kind of explosive vertical leap that had become my signature, throwing down a dunk that was both powerful and graceful. The sound of the ball slamming through the net was followed by an eruption from our fans that seemed to shake the entire arena. When I landed and turned toward the crowd, I saw something that made every moment of doubt and preparation worthwhile. My parents in the front row, my father with tears streaming down his face, and my mother holding a sign that read, "Size of your heart." We won the game 89-78, advancing to the state championship for the first time in school history. I finished with 36 points, 14 assists, and 8 steals, but the numbers that mattered most were the ones that couldn't be measured: the confidence we'd gained, the barriers we'd broken, and the message we'd sent about what was possible when people stopped accepting other people's limitations. The state championship game was everything I dreamed about in both of my lifetimes. A chance to prove definitively that the assumptions about my size and potential had been not just wrong, but laughably outdated. Our opponent was Central High, a program from Colorado Springs that had won 2 state titles in the past 5 years and featured a roster loaded with Division I recruits. They were led by Maria Santos, a 6'1" forward who'd signed with UCLA and was being touted as the best player in Colorado. The game was being broadcast statewide, with a sellout crowd that included college scouts from every major program in the country. As I walked onto the court for warm-ups, I could feel the weight of every assumption that had ever been made about what I could and couldn't accomplish. Central came out with the kind of aggressive defense that had made them champions: full court pressure combined with a physical play designed to intimidate smaller players. For the first few possessions, their strategy seemed to be working. We looked tentative and uncertain, like a team that was overwhelmed by the moment. That's when I decided to make the statement that would define not just this game, but my entire basketball career. I called for the ball and attacked their press with the kind of controlled fury that had been building inside me for 2 lifetimes. Instead of being intimidated by their size and physicality, I used it against them, drawing fouls and creating opportunities for my teammates to exploit their aggressive positioning. The first dunk came 8 minutes into the first quarter, on a fast break that started with a steal and ended with me rising above two defenders to throw down a slam that had the crowd on its feet. But this wasn't just about athleticism. It was about making a statement that would resonate far beyond this game. Central's coach called timeout immediately, his face flushed with the kind of frustration that comes from watching a game plan get demolished in real time. During the break, I could hear him screaming at his players about not letting that little girl embarrass you on national television. Those words, little girl, hit me like gasoline on a fire that had been burning for months. This wasn't just about winning a basketball game anymore. This was about changing what people thought was possible. The rest of the first half became a masterclass in controlled dominance. Every possession was an opportunity to demonstrate a different aspect of my game. Shooting when they played me loose, driving when they pressured me, distributing when they sent help. By halftime, we led by 15, and I had 22 points, 9 assists, and 5 steals. More importantly, I could see in Central's eyes the kind of doubt that spreads through a team when their foundational assumptions about competition get shattered. In the third quarter was when Maria Santos decided to take matters into her own hands. She was everything her reputation suggested: skilled, athletic, and competitive enough to will her team back into contention. For 8 minutes, she single-handedly kept Central in the game, scoring from every position on the court and playing defense with the kind of intensity that reminded everyone why she was headed to UCLA. But the fourth quarter belonged to me. With 12 minutes left and Central having cut our lead to 3, I took over the game completely. Not just scoring, though I did plenty of that, but controlling every aspect of the contest: the pace, the spacing, the emotional tenor, the strategic adjustments. I became a conductor orchestrating a symphony that Central couldn't match or counter. The defining moment came with 90 seconds left and our lead stretched back to 8. Central had just scored to cut the margin and was pressing for steals when I gathered a defensive rebound and pushed the ball in transition. Maria Santos was the only defender back, and I could see her making the calculation that her size and athleticism would allow her to contest whatever shot I was planning to take. As I approached the basket, she positioned herself between me and the rim, confident that she could prevent an easy score. What she couldn't account for was the explosive vertical leap I'd developed through months of systematic training, or the kind of determination that comes from being underestimated once too often. I gathered the ball at the free throw line and launched myself toward the basket, rising above her outstretched arms with the kind of hang time that seemed to suspend the laws of physics. For a moment that stretched like eternity. I was weightless, soaring above a defender who represented every assumption that had ever been made about my limitations. The dunk was clean and authoritative, my hand finishing well above the rim as the ball slammed through the net with a sound that echoed throughout the arena. The crowd erupted in a wall of noise that seemed to shake the building's foundation. But what I noticed most was Maria's expression as I hung on the rim: pure astonishment mixed with something that might have been respect. When I finally let go and landed on my feet, the scoreboard showed us leading by 10 with 73 seconds remaining. The game was essentially over, but the impact of that moment would resonate far beyond the final buzzer. We won the championship 84-74, completing the most improbable run in Colorado high school basketball history. I was named tournament MVP after averaging 31 points and 12 assists across our 4 games, but the individual honors felt secondary to what we'd accomplished as a team. As confetti fell from the ceiling and my teammates surrounded me in celebration, I looked up into the stands and found my parents. My father was crying openly, his hands pressed against his heart, while my mother held up her phone to record a moment that none of us would ever forget. But the moment that meant the most came during the trophy presentation, when I was handed the microphone to address the crowd. 6 months ago, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the arena's sound system, I was told I was too short to play basketball at this level. Tonight, we proved that dreams don't have height requirements. The roar from the crowd was deafening, but what I heard most clearly was the voice of that little girl I'd noticed in the stands during our first tournament game, now screaming at the top of her lungs that she was going to be a basketball player too, no matter what anyone told her about her size. I'm writing this from my apartment in Storrs, Connecticut, where I'm finishing my junior year as starting point guard for the University of Connecticut Huskies. We're ranked number 3 in the country and headed to the Elite Eight for the third consecutive season under my leadership. The scholarship offer from Coach Hayes came 2 days after our state championship victory, along with offers from Stanford, UCLA, Notre Dame, and 12 other Division I programs that had suddenly discovered the 5'6" point guard who'd been hiding in plain sight in small-town Colorado. I chose UConn because Coach Hayes understood something that most people still miss, that basketball is played between the lines, not on a measuring stick. My jersey number 23 was retired at Lincoln High during a ceremony last month, hanging in the rafters alongside the state championship banner that represents the culmination of everything I'd worked toward. Coach Davidson spoke at the ceremony, admitting publicly that cutting me from the team had been the biggest mistake of my coaching career. I appreciated the acknowledgement, but I also realized that his mistake had been my motivation. Without the chip on my shoulder, without the fuel of being underestimated, I might never have developed the systematic approach to improvement that transformed me from a good player into a great one. Derek Morrison, by the way, is currently playing Division III basketball at a small liberal arts college in Nebraska. He reached out on social media last year to congratulate me on making the All-American team, and I responded with genuine good wishes for his future. Some people need to learn their own lessons about underestimating others. The girl who was once told she was too short to compete at the highest level just signed a multi-year endorsement deal with Nike for their Heart Over Height campaign. The commercial features footage from my championship dunk, along with the tagline, "Some mountains look impossible to climb until you're standing on top of them." But the real satisfaction comes from the letters I receive from young players who say that watching my story convinced them to keep pursuing their dreams despite what other people told them about their limitations. Last week, I got a handwritten note from a 13-year-old girl in Ohio who said she was trying out for her high school team, even though everyone told her she was too small. "I watched your championship game on YouTube," she wrote, "and I realized that being underestimated is just another word for opportunity." She's right, of course. Every coach who told me I was too short, every player who assumed I couldn't compete, every scout who overlooked me because I didn't fit their template, they all gave me something more valuable than acceptance. They gave me motivation that burned hotter than any natural talent ever could. Next month, I'll graduate with a degree in sports psychology and begin my master's program while preparing for the WNBA draft. The projected first-round pick, who was once cut from her high school team for being too short, is now being compared to Sue Bird and Diana Taurasi by analysts who've somehow forgotten that height was ever supposed to matter. But my real legacy isn't measured in points or assists or championships won. It's measured in the young players who now believe that the only limitations that matter are the ones you accept for yourself. The dunk that broke the internet was just the beginning. The real story is what happens when you stop listening to people who tell you what you can't do and start showing them what you will do instead. Trust me, I've lived both versions of that story, and I can tell you which one feels better. Every morning, I still get up at 5 a.m. to work on my game. Not because I have anything left to prove to anyone else, but because I've learned that the moment you stop getting better is the moment you start getting passed by someone who refuses to accept their limitations. And somewhere out there, in a driveway in a small town nobody's ever heard of, there's another girl who's been told she's too something. Too short, too slow, too weak, too different. Working on her game in the pre-dawn darkness. Dreaming of the day when she'll prove that dreams don't have size requirements. When that day comes, I'll be watching from the stands, probably crying like my father did, holding up a sign that reads, "The size of your heart is the only measurement that matters." And some mountains look impossible to climb until you're standing on top of them, looking down at all the people who said it couldn't be done. The view from up here is beautiful.